So if, as advertised, I do a marvelous job, it's because the panel and Dr. Hong have done such a beautiful job of organizing what's going on, and I am literally reading Christine's script. So I was very excited about this session this morning and the topic, which is about disrupting the consequences of difficult histories through education. And we have two very distinguished panelists, and we're going to have a session where I think we're going to try to blend hearing from them, but also drawing on the wisdom of the room, because many of you teach in situations where you're also dealing with disrupting difficult histories in one way or another. But first, I want to introduce our panelists. The first one is Reverend Dr. Greer Anne Wenh-In Ng, and as a longtime member of both the Association of Professors, Practitioners, and Researchers in Religious Education, or APRE, she served on its executive committee in 1995 and 96, and was also the president in 2001, 2002. And she is currently the only Asian North American woman featured in the Christian Educators of the 20th Century web-based database. She may have practically stumbled into Christian education as an academic discipline out of her own commitment to church life and ministry practices, but she has become a staunch champion of multicultural and anti-racist religious education, with teaching and writing emphasis on the importance of intercultural and interfaith engagement, a critical reclaiming of religio-cultural traditions, and critical analysis of intersecting and systemic oppressions. From anonymous Christian to becoming ordained clergy in the United Church of Canada and a seminary professor, this reluctant pioneer gently transgresses boundaries and borders in her life, ministry, teaching, and scholarship, and may very well be known by those around her as one who, like James Lee Hunt's Abu Ben Abdin, loves God by loving neighbor. And our second panelist is Dr. Tsafrir Goldberg, who's been a Bible and history teacher for 12 years. His experiences in diverse classrooms in an urban school have led to a lifetime interest in the way students' identities intertwine with their engagement in difficult histories. His studies document the way Israelis of European and Middle Eastern descent discuss ongoing ethnic tensions through the histories of mass immigration. In consequent projects and curricular activities, Dr. Goldberg has shown how the study of the difficult history of the Jewish-Palestinian War impacts both Jewish and Palestinians' youth, their deliberation of the roots and resolution of protracted conflict. In his current position as head of the teacher education track in Israel's most culturally diverse university, Dr. Goldberg attempts to apply his insights to enhance Jewish, Muslim, Druze, and Christian students learning together. In an ongoing project, he is exploring the possibility that a difficult history could actually be a history of harmonious intergroup coexistence and cultural inspiration by tracing Jewish and Muslim adolescents' reactions to studying Jewish and Muslim cultural influences during the Middle Ages. So here's the plan for our session. We have two wonderful panelists, but before we turn to them, they wanted you to turn to one another. So with the question to get yourself thinking about this topic before that you hear from them. And here's the question. So you're going to have a partner sitting next to you so you can look around and identify that person. And you're going to ask each other, what difficult histories have you encountered and had to negotiate in your history of teaching and learning? And that could be either in your life as a student, or if you're someone who's teaching in multiple contexts, whether that's in a community of faith or whether that's in a university or another setting. But what difficult histories have you had to negotiate or have you encountered in your own teaching and learning? And they have given you 15 minutes for this. So this is time to really drop into an important conversation about your own experiences, insights, and questions related to this topic. So I'll invite you to turn to one another and start a conversation. Okay, so I'm going to invite us back together and to turn our attention to the front of the room. Thank you. It was very exciting to hear the room have such energy to start us off and get us warmed up. And now we're going to turn our attention to Dr. Ng.
Thank you, Katherine. I can't believe the wealth in this room, all your experiences, all your distinct identities, and yet all the common causes that we share in. So let me begin first by acknowledging the theme, as we do this theme, by acknowledging the land on which we stand today, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently of the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, Meeting Place, which is what Toronto means, is still the home of many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, which we know as North America. At the same time, I also want to acknowledge the ancestral lands of my own life, Jiujiang 9 streams in the southern part of China, the southern province of Guangdong, and my birthplace, Hong Kong, a British colony in those days. I also want to acknowledge the global territories on which I have at various times lived, studied, or worked on. So they include Macau, Hanoi, Singapore, and New York City. And because it's November 2nd, All Saints' Day, I want to lift up among this REA community our ancestor, David Ng, who contributed so much to our professional and spiritual life, and some colleagues from the Vancouver School of Theology who are now with the Saints, with whom I had the privilege of working together to set up a very pioneering program called the Native Ministries by Extension Master of Divinity Program in northern communities, but also one place in Arizona and then in Manitoba, and so on. I want especially to lift up the life of Charlotte Sullivan of both Gitsan and Chinese ancestry. But sadly, I also have to acknowledge that by the very fact that I had been able to make a home on this land, then I have to own my part in the consequences and some of the benefits of this particular difficult history of the lands, our land's colonization by early settlers, not only from Europe, but from other places later on as well. And I think that was so powerfully illustrated yesterday when we were able to take part in the Kairos blanket exercise. So the question that I'd like to lay before us is, as religious educators, researchers, and practitioners, in what ways can we take a fresh look on a sobered look into how, from now on, we are going to do our research, engage in our scholarship, theorize, and practice education in our faith communities. And thanks to Hanan's inspiration, I think what I'll do is invite you to just eavesdrop on some of my own struggles as I try to make sense out of how, at least to begin doing this. And he invited me especially to refer to the Asian communities in Canada, so that's what I will do. I think most of you know, even though the word Asian is just one, this is a very diverse community. I mean, you look around the room, we are Korean, we are Filipino, we are Vietnamese, we are Chinese in many provinces, speak different dialects and so on. And we also share some difficult histories among ourselves. As a Chinese person, I think I share with my Korean colleagues something that is best exemplified for me anyway, in the fact that not only my parents' generation, but even me and my husband refused to buy any Japanese cars. My son had no problem. He owns a Toyota, so. So we have these. So there's on more than one level on which we need to disrupt consequences, because those consequences are very specific to who we are, where we grew up, what our home nations did, because those of us who are in diaspora now have to acknowledge that. And I think what we have to learn, at least for me anyway, I have to learn is, so you think you also are excluded and minoritized and racialized in Canada by these dominant white folk, who call you visible minorities, along with indigenous peoples, because, as the blanket exercise team leader said, because of the color of her skin. But sometimes even when the skin looks quite, quote, normal. And I learned this from my there's a Haida student in Haida Gwaii, who looks totally European, but she's Haida, of mixed Haida ancestry, so she identifies with her Haida ancestry and identity, and she was one of our best students in that program. So my sort of challenge to myself, and hopefully to all of you, is as we sort of look through the eyes of these Asian people in diaspora or the subsequent generations who are Asian Canadians, Asian Americans, what do we share in common with indigenous communities, which is our focus, at least I hope to focus on? And are there distinctiveness between our histories? And if so, what does it mean for our work as religious educators? And then who are our allies? And hopefully through that, for all of us here who have emigrated from our home countries, or our ancestors have, no matter how many generations ago, then what is our responsibility now, and what is our accountability to the original inhabitants of this land? How their lands have been taken away, as we saw those blankets being wrapped up and so on, with all that history, which I don't need to go into. But it's to sort of invite us to say, if our faith calls us to justice, then what is our call right now? As I say, I'll just maybe spell out a little bit about reminder of ourselves about these distinctive features between original inhabitants and any immigrant group. But right now I'm looking at the Asian folk, but see how it applies to yourself. And those who are from international communities, think of your own native indigenous populations in your particular land, and how you relate to them, or if you are indigenous, how you relate to dominant groups. So as I sort of have mentioned, the most important thing for Asian Canadians, including a lot of people in our churches who say, that's not my problem, I didn't come and take the land away, But we are involved, we are implicated, because only Native peoples, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, are indigenous to this land, as we sort of understand history now. And also, land has been taken away. So land is what Native communities get so intimately tied to, in a way that as a person growing up in an urban center and then roaming around the globe, mostly in urban centers, I just had no conception of until I come face to face and was forced to rethink by people like Tinker, that no, he says, Native Americans and Canadians looked at space as the big category, not time. And we have been so sort of socialized into the thing that, oh, well, eternity and then now and so on. So it's always a temporal kind of consideration. But with Native peoples, it's land, it's space. It's makes me switch around my learning and thinking. And then one point which I think has to do with languages and so on, because there are some younger generation, Asian Canadians, Americans, and so on, who might be losing some of their cultures, their language, their history, their traditions, but never to the same extent by force, because it's just, by circumstance. And also, once their language, they lose their language, the language is still spoken in their homeland in Asia. So it isn't lost, in a sense, like it's still there. But not so with indigenous languages. With indigenous languages that only have a few hundred speakers, some 20 speakers, once it's lost, it is lost to our world civilization. So those things force me to face up to the fact that, no, I cannot claim to have experienced the same kind of racialization and exclusion as indigenous peoples, even though they are very true in this country. Japanese internment during the Second World War, and the head tax imposed on Chinese communities, individuals, or the Exclusion Act, which excluded any inflow from China or Chinese peoples, except diplomats and some people like that, until 1947. That's 2 years after the Second World War. So rather than identify all the factors and incidents of oppression, I would just lift up two and concentrate maybe more on the residential school part. One of them is the doctrine of discovery, so-called. So in 1992, people were celebrating Columbus discovering America. And then we have to decide, do we stand with our friends, brothers and sisters in the church who said, we are lamenting this, we're not celebrating it, because we were invaded, just like the Canaanites. You are the Israelites who come in and God promised it to you, but our land was invaded. So it certainly woke me up and made a big difference, or sort of a really impactful difference in the way I then reread the Bible to see how it could be actually an instrument of oppression from time to time, depending on whose side you're on or ally yourself with. As to the residential schools, I'm going to concentrate a bit more on it because it is something in which our church, my own church, the United Church of Canada, made up of former Congregationalists, Methodists, and 3/4 of the Presbyterians, we are one of those major denominations in Canada whom the government called on to operate these boarding schools called residential schools. And from yesterday's history telling, what happened there, right? The result is what? Almost, in fact, not virtual, I guess it's actual, cultural genocide. As we were taught in mission schools in Hong Kong, you were really punished if you spoke your own language or dialect even during recess. Now, multiply that by, I don't know how many times, for these young children taken out of their families and traditions and put in these boarding schools, which are to take the Indian out of the child. The first residential school was established in 1834, but the last one I learned actually wasn't closed until the year 2000. What does that say to me? I think it says that history doesn't stop. It doesn't stop when you can't read anymore about it. It continues. And the history, the consequences of this particular part of the history, the difficult history, continues on now intergenerationally through multi-generations. Because when you have not been parented, because your parents, you were taken away from your parents, those children who grew up, survivors, didn't know how to parent their children. And so it just keeps, going on and on, multiplying effect, with all the consequences, which ended up in many of those racial stereotypes that sometimes we come across on the screen. So how to be critical about interpreting those and deconstructing those for and with our students so that they can gain the skills to help in their own ministries when they go out. I also want to lift up one thing which was very sobering for me, and that was in 1876, something happened which is called the Indian Act. So this is about not even a decade after Canada became a federated dominion. So, not a colony anymore, but its own government. The Indian Act turned, quote, Indians into wards of the state. They have to ask the Indian agent if they want to leave their reserve. In Canada, it's called reserve. Their status as Indians are determined by a whole lot of really arbitrary rules, again, imposed by that act. And for me, the sobering thing is to realize that apparently South Africa's apartheid system took inspiration from this whole process. So when we stood in solidarity with the movement under Nelson Mandela, what are we talking and saying about our own systems? The role of the churches. The churches were very much a part of the dominant group, at least the European British churches are. So, or from France, so it would be the Roman Catholics. So the Roman Catholic orders, the Anglican Church and its dioceses, the United Church after 1925, and some of the Presbyterian churches were very complicit in forging this history, and therefore causing those consequences. I don't have time to go into all the details, but for a church that prides itself on doing justice as they do mission, how can we justify what's happening? Or at least when we begin to realize what was happening. So very quickly, I'll just say that between 1986 up to about 2015, let's say, the United Church did a number of firsts that I, as a United Church person and ordained minister, can give thanks for, although it doesn't stop there at all. These are just beginnings. So this includes the 1986 was the apology, the first church in Canada to make a formal apology to Native communities, mostly on the destruction we have played on their spiritual and religious life, because it was the moderator of the United Church, Bob Smith, who did that on behalf of the church. 1986. We then encouraged and gave funding to form the 13th conference. At that time, the regional groups were called conferences after the Methodist model. So this is the 13th conference, and it's called the All Native Circle Conference, and it used terminology like speaker and circle rather than executive minister and executive president, whatever, and conference. So it's in a small way we are making, keeping our learning alive. Our first moderator of native descent, a Cree, Stan Mackay, was elected in 1992, and under his leadership in the National Church, we began to establish ministerial training institutions, Dr. Jesse Soto Center and Francis Sandy Theological Center in Ontario. The other one was in Manitoba, to make training for the ministry, theological education, a lot more culturally contextual and taking the concerns of those particular communities in mind rather than imposing ATS standards on them. I was in one of those things in Vancouver, so I still remember. So let me just skip to this whole thing about the government. So the United Church, in a way, did this before the federal government, anyway, who perpetuated that Indian Act, were forced by lawsuits from Indian residential school survivors to acknowledge their part in it. And it was not until 2008, so this would be almost 10 years, 10 years, after the United Church had made another apology specific to its role in the residential schools. Then Prime Minister Harper, Canadian Prime Minister, did an apology, and he also was forced, I guess, to help establish something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Indian Schools Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission, on the model of the South African one. And, it held gatherings around the country to hear directly from survivors, inviting those people who taught as well, but very few, I'm told, actually came forward. Because in those schools, besides being, suffering cultural genocide, those young children were actually also physically and sexually abused by the people whom they look to as their protectors. They're supposed to trust in these teachers. So it's just a horror story. For us looking at now, I don't know how I would have done any better if I didn't know, and if my theology says I have got to convert everybody to my religion. So the commission held hearings across the country, ending in Ottawa, the capital, and they've produced their final report in 2015. 2015, the report came out, but it's not just a report to be put on the shelves. It has 94 very specific calls to action. In other words, don't just take this report and put it on the shelf. You need to do something about it, and we can tell you exactly how you can go about it. Well, one thing I learned from the apology by the United Church is the First Nations communities then said, we will receive your apology, but we cannot accept it yet until you have carried out what you intend to make up for, like how do you do reparations. So I'd like to maybe help us understand what the Commission report understands, how they understand reconciliation. For them, reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between, they use the term there, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. I was struck, it said establish, didn't say re-establish. So maybe the relationship wasn't there in the first place. And then they pointed out four elements or requirements in such reconciliation. There must be awareness of past history. There must be acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted. There must be atonement for the causes. This is really hard. And then there must be action accompanied by changed behavior, not just in laws. So, what are some of these calls to action, you might ask? Well, you can look it up online and go through all of them, but I'll just mention a few that I think matters to us as religious educators. Call number 62 asks that all school systems in Canada integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in public schools from kindergarten to grade 12. Calls 13 and 17 refers to the importance to recover and also to nurture the use of Indigenous languages in Canada. One way that I have learned how to do that is to support local attempts to recover some of those Indigenous names for streets and parks and so on. And partly it's because I myself had to go through that process to reclaim my name of Wenh-In, which has always been there, but never used it in a colonial system. It was really liberating and affirming when I was able finally to recognize that, oh yeah, I'm also Wenh-In, I'm not just Greer Anne. Those are some of the more general ones. You might ask, okay, so how do you do that? I think in public schools, they expect the curricula on all levels to be transformed by including the Indigenous knowledge and skills, but also using books and resources produced by Indigenous writers. So that's what we can do. In the church and in church and theological education, I think we have a few things that we can, that I think would be very central to this attempt. We must revamp mission education by paying attention to all these issues, demythologize our idea of being, missions such gold and glory things. This one for me is very central, to make sure that our faith formation, as distinct from education, is inclusive of these realities in our children, families, adults' lives. Decolonize the teaching of the Bible by paying attention to post-colonial ways of interpreting, or how minorities, such as this group in Canada, try to reading in between, how minoritized cultural communities interpret the Bible in Canada, a brand new publication this year. See Haran Kim Craig for details. This is also important in the training of our future leaders in the church, in religious communities, to make sure that they, like the teachers in schools, get exposed to these realities and learn how to minister in the new situation. I will conclude, I think, by sharing with you 4 questions or 4 points lifted up by last year's Canadian Broadcasting Corporation has a series called the Massey Lectures. In 2018, the lecturer was Tanya Taleka, and she produced a book called All Our Relations, Finding the Path Forward. She focused on the increasing rate of suicide among youth, Indigenous youth, not only in Canada and North America, but the world over. In Finland, northern Lapland, in in Australia, New Zealand, all these places. So she says, there are 4 questions that all humans must ask of themselves to make meaning of their lives. Where am I from? Where am I going? What is my purpose? And who am I? When these questions are not allowed a space to be discussed, then life has no meaning and the suicide rate goes up. I think by entitling her first chapter, "We Are Not Going Anywhere." Oh no, she said the first chapter is "We Were Always Here." The last chapter, she said, "We are not going anywhere." It sums up pretty well, her stance of resistance. And I just pray that all of us who have been exposed to some of these ideas could think about how to partner with her and all the communities represented in finding the path forward, even if it's just to kick out one stone or to dry up one swamp. So thank you, all my relations.
I think we can do questions with each other. So, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt the flow. My name is Sarah Tyler. I'm a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Thank you very much to the professor's talk. I just did want to point out something for myself. I'm only speaking for myself. Of course, we all have ways of interpreting the Bible. I personally do not see the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, as a history book. I don't read it, and scholarship certainly in religion has recognized that it should not be read as a history book for all sorts of reasons that they have explored. And so the reference, with all due respect to looking at the Israelites as invaders of the Canaanite lands, I found that remark rather troubling from my perspective as a religious Jew and as a faith person who believes in the importance of revisiting interpretations. The Israel Finkelstein, who is an Israeli archaeologist, has done a great amount of work showing, along with other of his colleagues, that the Israelite tribe depicted in the Bible were probably in tribes, groups of people from that area of land at that time, and that the story as depicted in the Bible is, from an archaeological perspective, not accurate. And that, just to point out, that redaction of the Bible and of the stories in the Hebrew Bible was done in Babylonia in an exile of the Jewish people, forced exile by Babylonians and onward. And it was from a perspective of a story of a people who had lost their land and were looking over into that land that was that they were exiled forcibly from. So I'm just saying that we have so many ways of interpreting our biblical heritage, and so I would caution us that when we take literally this Israelite invasion of Canaanites, that we also investigate other narrative ways of interpreting it, so that we can have honest, open conversation.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate both the interruption of this conversation to note, in one sense, the very weighted histories, right, of this. I don't know if you want to speak to that, or I would just say also there's layers and layers and years of interpretation of European colonizers using that narrative to justify their doctrine of discovery, and then Robert Warrior's, this is the article you were referring to, sort of response to liberationist theologies, naming the concern of using that story in exactly the way you're talking about, particularly as justification for colonizing. So do you want to say anything more about that?
I think what I'd like to do, is this working? Yeah. is to refer this to the whole community at the end when we have the open.
Okay.
And it could be one of the questions that come up because it is a very good example of the complexities of these struggles. And educators, how do we discern? And so on. So I won't say any more, but I can further on, we can talk.
And we also have now 5 minutes to turn to a neighbor and together sort of reflect on your own sort of responses to this conversation and the questions that you want to raise in the open, so we can sort of take a minute to integrate this presentation before we move on to the next very different context, very different presentation. So about 5 minutes with a neighbor. What do you make of this? What does it raise for you? What insights do you have? And do you have questions? Tough task, but come on back this way, and we're going to now hear from Dr. Goldberg, and then we'll again have paired conversations, and then time for question and answer with the whole room. So I invite you to turn your attention to Dr. Goldberg.
Okay. Thank you, and I'm awed speaking after Wenh-In. It's a real example both of committed leadership and of scholarship. I'm Tsafrir Goldberg from the University of Haifa, Israel. Thank you for having me here. My presentation, which I retitled, Is This the Other Within Me?, deals with how do Jewish and Muslim adolescents react to learning about interreligious similarities and influences. And in this sense, I'll be looking at the issue of disrupting difficult histories from an almost inverse perspective. As far as I had known, I should have been speaking after Magdalena Gross, who does a project on how Polish Catholics relate of collaboration and anti-Semitism during the Holocaust in Poland. And here it is a classical, difficult history. And I will be offering an almost opposed perspective. I'm dealing with a comparatively current difficult history, the charged relations between Jews and Muslims in the Holy Land. It's already long enough a history, or more or less over 100 years to be considered a history, but I'll be dealing with this history through a reference to a former, previous, almost medieval history of harmonious relations, and I will actually be raising the question whether a history of harmonious relations could perform a role in students' minds, take up the role of a difficult history. And let us think of it for a moment with ourselves. What happens when I find you or the other inside me? And I'm just citing from two very interesting occasions for learning, which I have had the fortune to participate in yesterday in this conference in the morning. I participated in Mary Elizabeth Moore's breakup presentation, and these are citations from this presentation. Human life is also considered sacred in Islam, as found in the Quran, and in which dignity is attributed to all humans, understood as inherent right, and thus Muslims often identify human dignity as the basis for human right. And Moore also cited Art Green. Can we imagine God as so arbitrary as to choose one nation and one place and one moment in human history in which the eternal divine's will was to be manifest? So in a sense, both citations and the whole of Dr. Moore's presentation spoke about the universality of human dignity across all religions as a basis for interreligious collaboration and a sense of all humans being equal. But we all also participated in the Kabbalat Shabbat in the evening, and we blessed in Hebrew with the words, "For you have chosen us and sanctified us," that is the Jewish nation of all nations. Incidentally, I looked up again in the reading excerpt, and I thought this was almost the only Hebrew excerpt which was transliterated but not translated, ironically. But this is a real tension within us. Are we looking at our religion and our identity as unique, essentially, or is it something which is shared across all religions? And what would happen to me if I suddenly discovered that I do own part of the other's religion? Yesterday, we heard quite a few of the participants during the Kairos exercise, for example, relate how they discovered their native nation's ancestry. Oh, I suddenly realized that I also have a Mississauga or a Métis or I'm a, how they said, two-canoe person. And did you notice, was this a derogative or a positive experience? A positive experience. Actually, indigeneity is now a very positive attribute. Think about Elizabeth Warren, who was blamed for trying to aspire for an unjustified indigenous Native American ancestry, or even, I think that the main criticism of Wenh-In's discussion was saying, you know, we are also indigenous, the Israelites, we are not invaders, and in this, there's a willingness to actually avoid the biblical narrative and go for a critical archaeological narrative in order to show that I'm indigenous. But finding the other within myself in a conflictual context, as is the context of the Holy Land, might not be so positive an experience. And this is what I will be relating to you now on. So now let's relate the same question to what happens when I find you inside me to the Israeli context. And I posited a research question we turned into a research project. How does the study of interreligious similarity and influence between Islam and Judaism affect learners' attitudes toward the other religions and its believers, that is, towards Islam and Muslims or towards Judaism and Jews? I should note that now we're looking not at the context of essentially a resolved conflict like in Canada or the US, but of a context of an intractable conflict, which is increasingly conceived as a religious conflict. And I will present to you the findings from two studies, and then I will compare them. One is a study among Jewish students who studied the birth of Islam and interreligious similarities and the life of Jews under Muslim rule, and its effect on Islamophobia, and the other is a study of Muslim students who studied, again, interreligious similarities and its effect on prejudice toward Jews. I should note that the uniqueness of these studies for this audience is both that they are studies positioned in the context of an ongoing conflict and actually an escalating interreligious conflict in some ways, and the fact that it's based not on religious education in denominational schools or Saturday or Sunday schools, but on mandatory curricula within a state system. I invite you to travel with me right now. I'm not a religious educator. In fact, I think I'm probably one of the only atheists in this room. Although I'm a Bible teacher for many years, Israel is one of the only countries where you find mandatory Bible teaching, grade 3 to 12, being performed in secular schools by secular Jews. And in here, I'm looking at history education, not at Bible education, but in Israel, history education devotes quite a lot of hours. It will be a third of the 7th graders' teaching time to, for example, interreligious relations and the birth of Islam. So the study of religion is part also of history education. So let's run on with the studies, and then I'll be willing for you to be as impolite as North Americans can be and to stop me midway for any clarification, because I'm presenting a study which is not within it goes against the grain for many of the researchers here, both in the sense that it's mainly quantitative and in the sense that it's drawing heavily on social psychological theories, which might be either alien or even contradictory to some of the hearer's sensibilities. So feel free to stop me and ask for clarification in any moment. So the first study is a study of Islamophobia in interfaith history teaching. It was performed with a problem in mind, which is not just Israeli, because Islamophobia is actually an international growing problem, definitely in the last 20 years, both with immigration and with, since the 2001 bombings, the sense of clash of cultures, global war. And it's also interesting because it's one of the last legitimate prejudices, as research shows. I'm looking both at stereotypes and perceived threat from the other religion and religious believers, and about social distance, aversion or willingness to meet Muslims among Jewish students. It's also actually a real lucky chance that we managed to approve this study program with the Israeli Ministry of Education, which actually later banned any exploration of racist attitudes among Israeli youths. And we assume that the factors for fear of the other religion and its believers have to do with historical perceptions, long-held beliefs of the history of the interrelations of the religions, as well as current realistic conflict or political affiliations, such as right-wing affiliation is sometimes more opposed to other religions, and to current media representation. So we're looking at an interreligious tension, which is feeding both on long-held views and on current media. And here is the part where we're looking at a more social psychological perspective. We assume that we could use, for example, counter-stereotypic examples of the religion and its believers as a way to change attitudes towards the other religion. And that we could look at the shared identity approach, which is quite a famous approach in prejudice reduction, to reduce prejudice and social distance attitudes. And this is where I return to the beginning of the presentations. We assume that showing that there's some kind of commonality or even a deep shared identity. Yesterday, I heard the term Abrahamic, I don't know how I would say it, religions as the source of a shared identity, and we were wondering if it could be a source for overcoming prejudice. And also exposure to the other's symbols and heritage as part of the intervention, but here we should add a question mark. Think of, for example, the almost unconditioned conditioned reflexive reactions to hijab, at least in Europe, to remember that exposure to religion and religious symbols might not be necessarily beneficial. I worked with about 351 Israeli 7th graders and some 9th graders. About 160 of them also completed both pre and post before and after the intervention. Coincidentally, we wound up teaching in classrooms which had three different conditions. One of them was studying about the history of Islam in a very conflictual context, because about 100 of the students studied it within a project-based learning which centered on the Crusades. And the students actually had a wonderful experience of posing as crusaders. They studied fencing and archery and fought within the crusader castles of Acre and Montfort. And they studied about the commonalities of Islam and Judaism along the way. The other condition was of commonalities. These were students which focused mainly on the commonalities between Islam and Judaism and the interrelations between Muslim and Jewish scholars in the Middle Ages. And last was the control group, which simply didn't study about Islam. We should note that due to the challenges that Israeli teachers face when teaching about Islam, about a third to half of the 7th grade history teachers just opt out of teaching about Islam at all. This is at least the estimate of the superintendent for the Jewish schools. So we had a nice control group also, which simply studied about Renaissance and Industrial Revolution. And I'll present some of the teaching materials in a minute, but the instruments I used for looking at the effects are the Islamophobia questionnaires and scales developed by psychologists of religion, Lee and Ernst and Bronstein, and which were presented in the Journal of Psychology of Religion and validated in a few European contexts, and we translated and tested them in the Israeli context. They mainly look at the stereotypes or aversion to encounter. And worked with a group of quite enthusiastic Jewish teachers, about 10 teachers, which also recorded the challenges. They knew that upon entering the classroom and saying we'll be studying about Islam, they'll be faced with strong and quite vocal negative stereotypes and prejudices, both towards Islam and towards the Muslim people. Some of the students simply said we won't study about the Quran and things like that. And a general atmosphere and fear hate to the other due to the specific time, which was called the stabbing intifada, in which, at least in the Jerusalem districts, quite a lot of the schools were exposed to. Three of the four schools I was working with in the state schools were actually almost directly exposed. Either the students were stabbed or close family relatives of students in these small schools, and there were even parents' doubts or objections to historical study of Islam. So we're looking at the context, which is really a live conflict. The students themselves study what is basically the standard Jewish curriculum for the 7th grade history in the state schools. There are explicit instruction to teach in this way, for example, emphasizing shared identity or emphasizing the benevolent attitude of Muslim rulers towards Jewish minorities in comparison. So students, for example, study the 5 pillars of Islam using the shared good fortune sign of the Khamsa, of the open hand, and they were looking at the similarities between the Salah, the prayer, and the regular prayers of the Jews, the Hajj and the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the Zakah and the charity of the Jews, Ramadan fasting and the Yom Kippur fasting, and the Shahada, the testament of the oneness of God, and the Kriyat Shema, the testament of the oneness of God in Judaism. This is something which rang a bell mainly among the Jewish boys, which many of whom were preparing for their bat mitzvah, their sort of Jewish confirmation. And they were also studying the religious tolerance pact of the Caliph Omar. And it's interesting, they did not have only positive reactions, but some of them would say, oh, they're copying us. What is this plagiarism? And so on. They also studied personal information about Prophet Muhammad as a revolutionary prophet, and about intergroup relations in medieval Spain, which is the golden age of medieval Jewry, where very strong and positive intercultural influences existed. In fact, many of the main philosophical, Jewish philosophical religious works, like those of the Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Levi, the Kuzari, were written in Arabic or in Arabic and Hebrew letters, or in Hebrew and Arabic letters, and translated later. And they studied about Jewish rabbis acknowledging Muslim philosophy and Sufism. And again, some of them were very impressed and related this to their family heritage in a very affirmative way. These are descendants of the immigrants from medieval Spain, the Mizrahi Jews. And some of them were saying, like, puzzled, were our grandfathers Arab Jews? Were they Muslim Jews? Could this be that we were really speaking Arab religion, Muslim religion, and so on? And we should note that this also hints at one of the weaknesses of this study, because there's a strong conflation between the nationalistic aspects, Arab and Jewish in the sense of a nation, and the religious aspects, Muslim and the Jewish aspects of the conflict. But we see that there's a strong emphasis here on the shared identity. And what were the effects of this commonality intervention on students' attitudes? We found quite a strong change in positive historical perceptions of Islam. We see that, we're looking here at prior to learning and after learning. And we see that the students in the control, see it here? No, in the control, that's the blue line. In the control condition, there's hardly any effect. But the students in the commonalities condition, which is now circled, had a strong positive change in their view of the role of historical Islam and its relations with Jews, while the students who were in the crusader condition, the conflictual condition, although they started out much more positively, and they were more of a liberal left political orientation, by the way, they ended up with a significant negative change, perhaps because they adopted the crusaders' outlook on the whole issue. And this also translated into a change in the willingness for encounter. We see that the students who changed positively in their view of the historical role of Islam also increased their willingness to encounter Muslims or to study about the other religion. And this was a significant effect, and there was found a significant correlation between the two changes. So it seems like a real strong effect, not as strong. These are all effects in the terms that social psychologists call them effects. They might be a statistically significant change, but which would mean 2 points or 3 points after the decimal point. But it is a significant change. And also there was a surprising relation to political affiliation. We found there was a stronger positive effect on right-wing affiliated students in Israel, which is a highly politicized society. By the 7th grade, almost all students, at least Jewish students, know to identify them, just like, Democrats and Republicans in current America. And the main positive effect of learning was surprisingly on the right-wing affiliated students. That is, it managed to cross political boundaries. And the same worked for what was called social distance, a version of encounter, which was a separate variable than willingness for closeness. And we found out that, again, the main positive effect was on the right-wing students. And this shows a very promising potential for studying interreligious, interfaith influence and similarities, seemingly. It is perhaps because the more right-wing students were also more conservative or observant, traditional, comparative to the left-wing ones. And it seems like there's some possible potential, even hope, that there's an independent change following the study of the other's religion, the history of religion, and for teachers, we might even say that we make a difference when we help our students encounter the other's religion. And we look at the history of religion as a source for counter-stereotypic images and for a common identity, and even possibly for an affirmation of our students. There's also some less promising information here for the European we found that the students who identified with the Crusaders, which is essentially the classical situation of studying about Middle Ages in Christian countries, actually, when they studied about the similarities with Islam, changed in a negative relation. So there might be a strong framing effect for the clash of civilizations general paradigm, and I wonder if this could be generalized to a Christian or a Western context. And then we went out, and many of the students themselves, the Jewish students, asked, do Muslim students have to study about Jewish religion? And so we went on to approve also a similar follow-up study among Muslim students. And this is study 2. The participants were 204 seventh graders from rural Arab schools in Israel. Most Christian Arabs are town people, and the villages are mainly segregated by religion, and of course the whole Israeli school system is segregated by language. So an Arabic-speaking school in a rural area would usually be 100% Muslim if it's a small village. And we used a limited, a narrow version of the intervention, but quite similar. We used a web excerpt about Judaism and Islam as sister religions, which was quite parallel to the Hebrew history textbook on medieval Islam, and excerpts from the Omar Pacts. And since we wanted to look also at a benevolent Jewish approach to minorities, we use an excerpt from the Israeli Declaration of Independence stating the freedom of religion and a benevolent approach to the non-Jewish dwellers of Palestine. And we use the same instrument, the Islamophobia scales, converted into attitudes toward Jews and Judaism and translated and retranslated into Arabic to assure validity. And Muslim teachers were facing similar challenges. They faced a climate of strong religious threat. It is an ongoing feeling in Israel that Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa is in danger, and it's the strongest identification point for Israeli Muslims. A context of ongoing discrimination of Muslims as a marginal minority in Israel, and a highly conservative community in which teachers hardly dare challenge or question when teaching about religion, and teaching about the sacred within the secular context is a real challenge for them. You have to speak with reverence. You speak of the caliphs as the pious caliphs, Khulafa al-Rashidun, and so on. But we found 2 teachers which were willing to use the same intervention, and we see very varied reactions in the process. We see when the teacher asked her students, after viewing the text and YouTube on the topic of the similarities, are there similarities between the 2 religions? So some of the students say no, and the teacher is frustrated. But I already said it a minute ago, prayer and testimony. Or the teacher tells them the Omar Pact gave the Jews religious freedom, and we believe in different religions, but each has complete freedom to its rituals, and a student interrupts them and say the Jews always interrupt the Muslims a lot each time they close Jerusalem and murder Muslims. So it's a really challenging context for the teacher in teaching. And when we looked at students' written responses, we see a very varied response. For example, speaking about the Omar Pact, some say the Omar Pact is completely righteous, while the Israelis do not really allow Jewish freedom but try to convert the Muslims. Others say it's a fair enough relation from both sides. But let's look at the effects on students' attitudes. And we found a very puzzling effect. In both in both classrooms, we had opposed effects, but not the expected effects. The positive change occurred in the control classrooms, who only answered twice to the questionnaire, but didn't study about Muslim-Jewish relations. While there was a mild negative effect in the intervention classrooms with reference to the historical perceptions about Judaism and Jewish-Muslim relations. And when we looked at stereotypes, there was an even enhancement of negative stereotypes among the intervention classrooms. So actually studying about the Omar Pact and the Declaration of Independence and the similarities did not have the expected positive effect. When we compared the effects on Jews and Muslim students, we found really diametrically opposed effects, both on the historical perceptions, where Jews actually increased positive perceptions, while Muslim students who studied in the communality context increased negative perceptions. And we found it also in stereotype change, where Muslim students increased stereotypes, while Jewish students slightly decreased stereotypes. And this is really puzzling, and even perhaps for an educator, a frustrating outcome, which I wondered how to explain, and which shows us that things are not as simple and harmonious as we might expect through the ongoing declarations of commitment to interreligious collaboration, which are shown here in this very benevolent atmosphere. And I think this is a real question. On the one hand, we found a strong potential for interfaith teaching as a method for prejudice reduction and possibly for reconciliation or overcoming the ongoing history of conflict between religions. On the other hand, it could be that there are very different potential based on the different histories, and it's a real issue whether Christians would be deadlocked in the clash of cultures heritage when they try to apply similar methods. We also find that there might be a very different potential for the minority and the majority, and it might be that for the Muslims as a religious minority, acknowledging this similarity is actually a more challenging situation. And that's really interesting because in most of the countries where you are involved, except for maybe Turkey, Muslims are a minority religion, which is not the classical role of Islam. Islam is a ruling religion. And I'm really wondering what is the source of this diametrically opposed effect to learning a similarity. We are looking at the promise of shared identity and understanding whether versus the perils of distinctiveness threat, perhaps. Because in the sense of religion and identity, there's also a sense of uniqueness which we want to preserve. I want to thank you, and I want to open this to our discussion because I do think of how to make an ongoing research of this, as I believe that religion is a growing force in the Middle East, definitely, and it will have to be a trajectory for reconciliation and understanding. Thank you very much.
So just in terms of process, we're going to give you another few minutes to turn to someone next to you to reflect on the presentation that you've just heard and to really refine and sharpen your sort of insights and questions with one another. And then we'll have about 10 minutes for open forum question and answer. So take a few minutes with your neighbor again to think about what you've just heard. I know our panelists are excited that they have generated such great conversation. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to try to get 2 or 3 questions from the group so the panelists can get a sense of where the room is, and then they're going to address those as a group. So I believe I have this mic. I have maybe another mic we could run around with, and then we'll get 2 or 3 concise questions that are actually questions, and then they will address those questions. So here we go. There's one. We got.
Great, thanks. Hi. I was actually just going to ask, I know, at least from what I believe, I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, is that the original intent of the curriculum was drafted with the Jewish students in mind, and then you adapted the Jewish curriculum for the Muslim students. And so my question is, do you think it would have been different had you created 2 different set of curriculum, one for the Jewish students and one for the Muslim community?
Great, thank you. Charles, what was yours?
Yes, my question was in the language that was used, it described similarities and influences. And I wonder if that was intentionally done instead of using the more similarities and differences. So whether there was a resistance to actually even go to that word, differences. And then the other question I had was just a little bit more elaboration on the study that presented Islamophobia as a legitimate prejudice. Because as I look at a legitimate prejudice and I substitute other words for prejudice, I could say a legitimate racism, a legitimate oppression. So I just wonder how legitimate that is. One of the former members of Trump's cabinet described Islamophobia as Islamorealism.
All right, and just as a reminder, we're working with both presentations. Does anybody have a question that's directed at the earlier presentation? All right, get one, because we'll come back to that. One more question then.
I wonder if the question, can I see the other in me? It may be if we extend the question, can I see what the other sees? And switch the roles, how would be the effect?
All right, so we're going to let Dr. Goldberg field those three, and then meanwhile, people are going to be thinking about things for Dr. Wenh-In.
Thank you. Well, I'll answer the easiest question in advance. There's the references in the presentation. I'll upload it to the web, but indeed, it is one of, as anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice are considered really a derogatory attribute for a person, it appears that Islamophobia or anti-Muslim prejudice achieves receives less criticism and achieves more legitimacy. That's not my research. It's something I draw upon just because it's the statement of the problem. I'm not sure it was a question because you yourself exemplified how this works out. As for the question of two different curricula, well, Israel actually is a highly segregated, Israel's system is a highly segregated system, and it has 4 to 5 different history curricula. So we started out with a very different curriculum for each of the two groups. And incidentally, for the Muslim students, although the 7th graders do have a lot of designated lessons devoted to the birth of Islam, they hardly have any of them related to Jewish-Muslim relations and not at all to the similarities. I'm not sure if this is an intentional approach from the Ministry of Education trying not to make the two religions meet because, as I said, for the Jewish schools it is mandatory to speak about similarities. But in this sense, our intervention was to make the two curricula similar. The normal situation would be for the two curricula to be different, and then usually Muslim students would not approach the issue of similarities. And I think it's really interesting to just look at what happens. You could say that the control group in the Muslim schools had a different curriculum. But I'm not sure that is really representative because we might have tried to stress then the uniqueness of Islam or something like that. And the last thing I would like to clarify something. The idea of is it the other inside me was my title, but not the intervention question. The students were not asked, do you see the Muslim inside you? This is just my interpretation. So it would be a very interesting also intervention cue, for example, for an intervention project. And I do think of expanding the project and just replicating the study itself because there are some other very strong discrepancies between the two interventions. The Jewish students studied for 2 to 3 months in a very creative way, while the Muslim students studied for 2 weeks to a month in a more limited frontal lecturing approach and so on. So there are many ways to look at content and duration and even context in ways which will make them more equivalent for a better comparison. Oh, the similarities and differences. This was an intentional omission on our behalf because we're looking to stress this shared identity. We could have stressed oppression, the first issues of first conversion and martyrdom in Jewish Middle Ages were under Muslim Muwahhidun rule and so on. We could have stressed this, but this was an intentional, even a manipulative in some way, approach to history teaching as a way to achieve a sense of shared Abrahamic identity. So you were right that we are crossing out the idea of differences.
Right. Any 2 more questions, let's say, from the group hopefully partially related to the first presentation.
Dr. Ng, thank you very much for your presentation. I am struck by the many points of intersectionality in your story, and I'm wondering about the way in which you navigate those many layers in different audiences. Because it strikes me that as you were pointing out the diversities that exist here, that sometimes audiences are differently diverse or less diverse. And I'm just curious to hear some ways of your wisdom about how you navigate those various aspects of identity and positionality. Thank you.
I think I may have heard something similar coming out of both presentations, but I'd love to hear Dr. Ng respond to this. It seems to me partly what I'm hearing is that information is important but not sufficient to change hearts. And I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Ng, about your perspective of that, not only as an Asian Canadian, but as somebody who has chosen not to accept the invitation to talk about that, but to talk instead about the Native struggles and issues and ways that hearts need to be changed in Canada about that.
We'll get our one last question here, and then we'll let the panel have the final word.
My question was just at the summation of your talk, and you talked about having a survey done. You had 300 plus participants in the project, but okay, all right, but you only had 150 survey completions.
No. Yeah, because I think it's better if one analyzes first.
Okay, so I'll let you, either one of those is live, I think.
So I'll close the other. Works.
Thank you for those, what came out of your understanding and your experience, I'm sure. So to go to the first speaker first, yes, it is tricky, to say the least. And I would love, from the buzz that went in the room, how you each, in your situation, dealt with it. For me, I think one of my, quote, guidelines is, well, one of them, but there are several. One of them is to be really, really contextual to that particular group. So just as a quick example, within let's say a student group, okay, there are people from a very high context culture, like a Korean student, and then of course, quote, ordinary Canadian who grew up in a very low context culture. Then when you bring some either information piece or an insight to them, they react very differently because of what they have come from. So one of the cautions I have learned is to get them to articulate where they got that way of reacting or resonating or resisting that particular suggestion. And then to get other people to share a little bit of where they come from, just to make sure that there's no one normativity for everybody to conspire to. Except, I guess, for Christians, we do have some faith guidelines, but that's very in a very particular situation. So it's for each of them to articulate where they got their grounding. And then a deeper thing would be then, if we have enough time in the semester or whatever, or in their essays, they could probe that a little deeper. I don't know if that's useful. Steve, your question is really, really touches at the heart, I think, of the people who are spiritual but not religious also have to address, which is information alone is not sufficient. So how do you move hearts? And I guess one reference I could make is to a holistic way of addressing the topic in front of us. So I go back to the Kairos blanket exercise, because it is totally holistic. If you recall, they gave us so much information, right? We learn them. We learn them in an embodied way, but we also, I think there was also some conversion experience in the sense of, yeah, I never realized that, now I do. And that has to do with what I call sort of post or trans pedagogical powers and preparations and stuff. So I don't know, like, with more chances to get at, okay, you know, how do we nurture their spirituality, how to write journals and stuff. But in an academic setting, it's a real juggling ball to do the, quote, the kind of research that is recognized in still quite often in our Western kind of academies, and to say, well, what about autoethnography? When I can use my experience, and it's just should be as valid, if you know. So I think this is one way I would try to help students when they have to go out and work with people, to discern which situation you are in and the kind of people you work with, and then see which approach might be more effective. And lots of prayer.
I have a short reference to Wenh-In's last response. So we had a strong attrition. We used quite a lot of survey work, and since both Israeli students are very undisciplined, and Israeli teachers are renowned for not noting down absentees and so on, so the difference between the actual presence in both times of survey taking were quite pronounced. We did manage to assure that there was no significant difference in initial views between those who went on to complete the whole survey study and those who did not. I want to add one word about the whole approach, this social psychological approach, and it relates mainly to Wenh-In's first answer. This approach is essentially reductionist. It ignores the fact that there is no such thing as a simple Muslim kid, or definitely not a simple Jewish secular kid, and so on. There are wide spectrums of identification and attitudes, which could also be tracked, if you want to add another 2 or 3 surveys, but would actually, again, be missed in some way, because you miss the actual experience of the students at the moment. And I think it is very true that it's the issue of embodiment also, in this case, just a hint. The kids who just practiced as crusaders, it had such a strong effect on their whole attitudes that it shows that the whole issue of embodiment and, on the other hand, encounter, which was not practiced at all in this intervention, would have a much stronger effect than simple information. But simple information is what teachers usually do, so I started out with the baseline of the mandatory curriculum. So I think this is Wenh-In's caution and imploration to use a much more active and holistic approach to education, and not just religious education, would definitely be the last word on the topic.
Thank you to both of our panelists.